Again, welcome to the final Dozuki workshop series of 2014. We are really jazzed to have 45 minutes to better writing with Julia Bluff here, editor-in-chief at iFixit. And here we go. I'm, again, Kate Emma Smith. I'm the Director of Outreach here at Dozuki and the hostess for all of your workshops. You can contact me at kate@dozuki.com or follow me on Twitter at Kate Emma Smith. And Julia, can you just maybe take a couple minutes to introduce yourself? We are so excited, and for those who aren't familiar with your work or maybe not familiar with iFixit.
Yeah. I guess to start off with a little bit about iFixit, which is the company that I work for, and we're sort of sibling companies with Dozuki. iFixit is a documentation platform, essentially, that what we're doing is we're teaching novices how to fix the things that they own. So we produce a lot of technical writing that's meant for the public. It's meant for people who have little to no understanding of how the inside of their electronics work. And then we teach them how to take apart things like laptops and iPhones and how to fix the components inside. And we do that through technical writing. And then my job here at iFixit is that I sort of head up the editorial department at iFixit, which means I'm drafting articles for magazines. I work very closely with our CEO to get our position about technical writing, and not just about technical writing, but about repair in general out to the public. And then I do a lot of editing of the writing that goes both in and out of this building because we want to maintain a very rigorous standard for the type of writing that we put out into the world, and that applies to all business communication that we put out. So I do quite a bit of editing of and curating content for all of the business communication that happens at iFixit.
Certainly. And I have a definitely warm spot for our expert today because we've worked together for several years now. Both Julia and I met in a graduate program, and we both taught. And so I'm really, really excited to have you here as a good close friend and a fellow writer.
Yeah, and just to chime in on that, I know that most of you know Kate as the resident Dozuki hostess, but Kate's very much an expert in writing in her own right. She does a lot of writing for Dozuki. She helps me out with writing as well. She edits my work. So she's going to chime in throughout the presentation and sort of help me as a co-expert on how to write better.
Yes. Yeah. This is gonna be fun. We're switching it up a little bit this time.
Yeah.
And then for those of you who have not joined us before with the workshop, just to let everybody know, we really love and encourage engaging during the workshop. And there's two ways that you can do that. You can either type out your questions in the message interface and clarifying questions, just anything maybe we're not covering. Feel free, I'll be fielding them the entire time. Or again, you can email Julia or myself directly for any specific comments, questions, or concerns, certainly. And just so that way everybody's on board, here's our awesome workshop roadmap. So jazzed about it. We're going to be going through about 6 different points. First, we're going to talk a little bit about what it means when we talk about technical writing. What does that include? The pre-writing process, audience awareness, conciseness, which is never easy for anybody, but always very necessary. Communication with multimedia. So we will talk a little bit about photography, videography, illustrations, diagrams, that whole gamut. And then end off on editing, which is one of the trickiest, hardest spots to be in the entire writing process, but we'll talk about that and, of course, conclude with some Q&A. All right, so we will start at number 1. What does technical writing mean? Well, I want to open up that conversation with a fantastic quote from Mark Twain, a writer that we both admire, who says the difference between the right word and the almost right word is the difference between the lightning and a lightning bug, and I think that's really fantastic. Technical writing is a very, very sensitive topic with how you're using your words, how you're phrasing certain things, and maybe you can kick us off with a nice, solid definition.
Yeah, I mean, technical writing is a huge field, and it's important to narrow it down for our purposes, just to give you a sense of what this particular presentation is about, and specifically what it's not about as well. So in that, technical writing is a huge field that can apply to any professional writing or technical writing that takes place in a professional setting. The way that we like to use the term technical writing here at iFixit is what we're talking about is writing that's meant to help a reader accomplish some sort of a task, to produce something physical and tangible in the real world. So that for us, that can include how-to manuals, training manuals, procedural documentation, any sort of writing at all that shepherds the reader through a process and helps them accomplish something. And I think that's a really important kind of writing.
It is.
And very often it's stigmatized as a writing that doesn't take a lot of creative skill, or it's just an afterthought, or it's boring writing. But coming from the world of iFixit, where we do technical writing, and we've done technical writing for the past 10 years, we have a very specific viewpoint about all of the important things that technical writing can accomplish. And if you think about it, there's something like a sacred duty in technical writing, in that you are functioning as a teacher.
Yeah.
And the work that you produce teaches your reader how to do something that they could not have done without you. And that's powerful. So at iFixit, since we teach people, and novices particularly, how to fix their own stuff, because we've worked very hard at producing technical writing and producing effective technical writing, we've been able to teach millions and millions and millions of people every single year how to fix their things. And that's something that they would not have been able to do without the work that we produce. So I think it's a really great thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about technical writing and you're thinking about the type of work that you produce.
Definitely. And as you can see, some of the really great images of all the lives that iFixit has touched in a writing capacity. This really great image back here is a teacher with a student at a Catholic girls' school in Louisiana, and I was excited. I got to talk to them for a little bit, and they're actually using iFixit's technical documentation in order to fix electronics, which is pretty fantastic. I think most of us are pretty afraid of touching our electronics, fixing them, getting in there, getting into the guts. But as you can see, with great technical writing, the kind that you and the rest of the technical writers at iFixit produce, really any age, any gender, any kind of position in life, you can help somebody accomplish that task.
Yeah, it gives them the confidence to do something like this, which is not something that's particularly in their wheelhouse, but they can do it because they have good instructions, and that's the potential of technical writing.
Definitely. So we will start with the pre-writing process. There's, I think, a kind of a gut reaction for people to just dive in and start writing, but there is some strategy that goes into the pre-writing process before you even, touch pen to paper, or, fingers to keys, however you want to go about that. And the quote that's opening us up on this is by the wonderful, beautiful Anne Lamott. All good writing begins with terrible first efforts. You need to start somewhere. And I think that's something that is still hard for me to digest, is, my first couple efforts are always pretty bad, but that's okay. You have to start somewhere. And here are some of our tips of how to approach the beginning line, the starting line, so to say.
Yeah, and for bad first efforts are just part of the process, and that's fine. And everybody has their own pre-writing process. I know that Kate meticulously drafts. I'm a meticulous note taker, and I very much believe in having a plan before you ever start. And the nice thing about writing procedures is that it's already sort of grouped into an outline for you, and you do need outlines as you write. Especially for my purposes, I can't function without them. It's like trying to drive somewhere and only knowing that you need to go left. So meticulous outlines are a really nice thing to have. But more than that, I think communication is just key as you're describing processes. So we're very lucky at iFixit that our technical writers are not just technical writers, they're also engineers. So they're experts, but they're also excellent writers. And we're very aware that we're very lucky that we have that, because most of the time that's not the case. You have engineers in one department and designers in another department, and then technical writers in another department. And many times they don't really meet in the middle. And that's really, really, really important, because as we all know, when you're writing about how to do something, it's pretty important that you know how to do it first. So when you're taking on any sort of how-to task, any sort of procedural instructional task, step one is always to get your hands dirty. If you're writing about a process, know that process inside out. Know the product inside out. Know the tools that you're working with inside out. And as you go through the process yourself, you're going to glean certain tips and tricks that are going to be useful for you as a writer. And then communicate as often as possible with your experts.
Yes.
So talk to the engineers, talk to the people on the production line who are actually going through the process every single day. Talk to the designers and figure out why they designed things to work the way they did. And what they tell you will inform your writing. And I think especially if you're a novice coming into this and you don't particularly know the process, you can use that viewpoint to your advantage, especially if you're writing training material, because you know exactly where your audience is coming from and you'll be able to integrate that. So As a writer, when I'm writing about something that I'm not particularly well versed in, like the first thing I do is just ask stupid questions, and I ask them over and over again.
No, and it's like, I think that's a perfect kind of, you need to have a certain level of humility when it comes to the writing process, is that you have to be all right with asking the questions that other people might have a little too much pride to ask.
Yeah.
Because down the road, you're going to need to know that information. And posing in writing, technical writing particularly, is not a good way to go.
Yeah, and I can guarantee that if you think you have a stupid question, your reader is going to have that question as well, and it's going to be really important for them to know the answer to that. So ask a lot of questions of your experts and ask them often.
Yeah, absolutely. So that leads us, though, into collaboration is key. One of the things that I know, Julia, you're very well versed in now is how to co-write with your coworkers, which can be a pretty daunting process and be very frustrating. Certainly, there are companies out there, I'm sure in our audience who would be familiar with this, that they have very opinionated coworkers, and co-writing can be a pretty intense process, definitely.
Yeah, collaboration is always key, especially in technical writing, because you need as many different viewpoints as possible to sort of match the viewpoints that the audience is going to have and where they're coming from. But, at iFixit, there's usually one author's name on a guide, but there are so many hands that have been... that have helped shape that particular piece of documentation. Yeah. As many as 10 different authors on a single guide will go through and meticulously work together and bring their own viewpoints and bring their own writing and their own skill to make that piece of documentation as perfect as it can be for a public audience.
Absolutely. And I think that's the thing is with collaboration, there's probably always something a writer by themselves doesn't anticipate, maybe the audience not understanding or not knowing. It's very good to kind of fill in those dots and make assumptions about your audience, which leads us certainly to audience awareness. Technical writing is all about the audience. Again, back to our definition, that it's showing someone else how to do something, not showing off what you know, but helping the other person get on your get on your page, on your level. And the quote for opening up this section, Stephen King, as we all know, famous writer, novelist, essayist, and the whole gamut, explains description begins in the writer's imagination, but should finish in the reader's. And so I'm going to take us a little bit back to our old composition classes for a moment. This may look familiar to some people who took a writing class. If not, don't let it intimidate you or anything. What we're going to focus on is this awesome green triangle, which you've got the speaker, the message, and the audience. So those are the three components that should be your takeaways. I think we were, Julie and I were talking earlier about this triangle, and these are the three components to always already be anticipating. And most of us will just focus on the speaker and the message, just making sure your purpose is getting out there, making sure you're saying what you want to say, but we tend to forget that the audience... what they might be thinking, or at least anticipating their thoughts.
When you're writing, it's very easy to sort of get into a spot in your head and go somewhere, and we all very often forget that writing doesn't take place in a vacuum, that the things that we're producing are meant to be consumed by somebody, and so step one of writing is always to know your audience and to know them inside out, because the purpose of showing this triangle is also showing that all of these three things, the writer, the purpose of writing, and the audience, these are all interconnected and interdependent. So when your audience shifts, how you write is going to shift, which is why we write about processes differently when they're made for novices than when they are for experts. So step one is always to evaluate your audience, figure out what they know, what they don't know, what language they're using, what words we need to introduce them to, because that's absolutely going to inform and shape your writing going forward. So you have to know that first.
Definitely. It's really great to think of it almost like a three-legged stool. If one of these legs is either not there or maybe kind of imbalanced, the whole stool is going to fall over, right? So it's this constant just balancing act I'd say writers are always having to do. So we have a really great audience question from Dennis Bishop. I'm very excited about this because I feel like many people must be asking it. He says, I sometimes know where to start based on the reader's technical level. I don't want to insult them, and I don't want to confuse them either. How do you strike a happy medium? So at least for iFixit, they've pretty anchored that down of that medium, because that's really important to get.
Yeah, there's usually, of course, you never want to write down to your readers, but it's actually a very hard thing to do. More information is always a nice thing to provide. And I don't think we've ever written something and someone has given us feedback was like, no, that was too easy. No, you explained too much. You did too much. So as long as you have their technical level, I think that's the first step in striking the right balance.
Certainly. And so I know, you and I see a lot of technical writing in our daily lives here over at Dozuki and iFixit. And I definitely want to acknowledge what we've determined in our experiences over the years, who is the biggest culprit of turning good writing into bad writing. And this is something that most of you will have had your own experiences with, but our answer is jargon.
Yeah, jargon. Jargon is actually one of my pet peeves in technical writing, and I go through very often as an editor and start to prune it out. So just to define our terms, jargon is specialized language used within specialized industries to describe specialized terms.
Yes.
So it's very much specialized language, and the longer we spend in a field, the less we recognize that we're not using everyday language, that we're using these specialized terms that people outside of our industry don't necessarily understand. And I mean, that's the reason why you can sit down and have a conversation with a lawyer or a doctor and come away from that conversation not knowing anything at all of what they've said. It's because they're using specialized language in their field, and then they make an assumption that other people know that language as well. That's not to say that you can never use jargon. Sometimes it's very helpful, but it always comes back to audience awareness. In that, like if you're an expert and you're writing to other experts, it's fine to use jargon. But if you're writing to people who aren't experts, if they're novice level, or even if it's public facing documentation, it's meant for a third party who's not in your industry.
Absolutely.
Then be very, very careful with jargon. So for an example, the military is particularly bad at this. If you read any sort of training documentation for the military, they're constantly using acronyms and they're constantly using specialized jargon to describe things in their field. And it takes like 3 months of boot camp for somebody to learn that and then know what people are talking about and know where to go on base. But that's not particularly the best way to on-ramp somebody new coming into your company. So be very, very conscious of the language that you're using.
This is a very good point for those in the audience who are preparing training manuals, any training material. And again, like you were saying, it's not to avoid jargon altogether, but the best way to be responsible with your jargon is definitely to define your words early and often.
Yeah.
I really like that.
Yeah. So question your assumptions, figure out what language your audience knows and what they don't know. And then define that phrase the first time you use it, and then keep defining that phrase. Like, you don't have to always come back with the same definition, but point your reader periodically back to the first definition so they can get a sense and keep that new word in their mental Rolodex.
Certainly. And again, don't assume that your readers understand your terms. And definitely the takeaway would be to define it early and often, certainly. And again, I just wanted to kind of bring this concept back up that, when we're in an industry for a certain amount of time, you do forget that you are using jargon, certainly. We have a question from, excuse my pronunciation, Jurgen Pintaki. He's asking, are we trying to say that we're to leave out jargon? And he's concerned that maybe the audience won't take him seriously should he leave out that jargon.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on who you're writing to. If you're writing to experts, absolutely, you can use that jargon. And yes, many times it does give you a level of respect from your readers who also know that language. The problem is when you're not writing to experts, that you very, very quickly lose the clarity in your writing. So you do have to strike a balance. You can use those words, you just need to define them. And you have to know your audience. Because that's going to inform how much jargon you can and how much jargon you can't use.
Absolutely. Yep. Thank you so much for that. So we're going to go to our next point, being concise. Never easy, always necessary. And I love this. My man, Nathaniel Hawthorne, what a great author. Easy reading is really damn hard writing. And that's so true. I know that, iFixit has done a fantastic job of making their technical documentation as easy as possible to read. But, I've seen those technical writers out there, and it's hours and painstaking hours trying to make sure they've gotten all the right words the correct way.
Yeah. So I guess once again, to define our terms, I like to think of concise writing or concision as saying as much as possible with as few words as necessary.
Yes.
And that can be really, really difficult, and it takes a lot of pruning, and it takes a lot of awareness of yourself as a writer. And it's sometimes something that technical documentation and technical writers aren't necessarily great at. So, I mean, just show the example, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have this really great passage. For those of you who've ever read the Tech Writing Handbook, which, again, Julia is co-author of, they use this really great and horrible passage. So I'm going to read it to us really fast. So it says, we suggest you complete and return the enclosed product registration card promptly to facilitate verification of the date of original purchase. However, return of the product registration card does not eliminate the need for the consumer to maintain maintain the original proof of purchase in order to obtain the warranty benefits. I'm losing it already. All right, last sentence. In the event that you do not have proof of purchase, the purchase date for purposes of the warranty will be the date of the manufacturer. I'm not really sure what just happened. I think that was just as painful for everyone in the audience as it was for me. So what do we want to say about this horrible paragraph?
I think the first important thing to say is this is a real life example, and it's not necessarily a rare real life example. I found this in a product manual for a consumer product. I think it was a blender or something. And the entire manual reads like this. So I guess, where do we start? This particular passage is very, very often very symptomatic of bad technical writing.
Right.
So what's wrong with it? Obviously, it's really wordy. The sentences are really long. And personally, I think that this writer has really lost sense of audience and just really forgotten that actual human beings are reading the work that they're producing.
Definitely.
The tone, or like the atmosphere of the writing, it's very wooden and it's very mechanical. And because of that, it's very, very difficult to read. Reading this particular passage is like walking through mud.
Yeah, that wasn't pleasant at all.
No, and readers aren't going to retain any of the information because it's so difficult to read through. You just sort of glaze over. So I think the takeaway here is that concise writing is easy writing, and specifically when you're documenting procedures, you need easy writing because you want someone to reproduce the procedure that you're describing. So that particular passage is 76 words. We went through and revised it, but I want to sort of take you through the thought process that we went through.
As you can see, we kind of marked it up a little bit. Clearly, one of the things that we noticed was definitely that the sentences were horribly, horribly long. There were a lot of, again, the tone is something that kind of, I think people take a little bit for granted of how to deal with their tone. The tone is not very welcoming. It's not very accessible at all. And
so the first thing that Kyle and I did when we were revising this particular passage is we went through and we pulled out all of the empty words. And another thing that I like to think of as a red flag is like we went through and looked at the amount of prepositions in this particular passage. So in case you're unfamiliar, prepositions are really small words, but they show relationships between different words in a sentence. So words like of and to.
They're shown in red on our passage.
And
right there.
you're never going to prune all of the prepositions out of your sentences, and you really shouldn't. But as a writer, that you should be aware that using a lot of prepositions sort of locks you into building a longer sentence. So there's a particular phrase in this passage that I think is important. So they say the need for the consumer to maintain the original proof of purchase, right? So there are 3 prepositions in that statement. There's for, to, and of, and it's just part of a sentence. But really all they're trying to say is keep the proof of purchase. And that's all they had to say. Keep the proof of purchase, which sort of brings us to the next point is you want to use active verbs. You're telling someone how to do something, so you should use strong active verbs in order to do that. So I guess we should go to the revise.
So here's what Kyle and Julia came up with the revision. Lot shorter, and they actually cut it over half to 37 words. And I'll read that for you real quick. Please return your completed product registration cards so we can verify your purchase date. Keep the original proof of purchase to secure your warranty benefits. If you don't know the purchase date, give the manufacturer date instead. That was much more pleasant.
Yeah, so it's much shorter. There's a healthy mix of short and long sentences. We were really careful about how we used our prepositions, so the relationships within the sentence aren't all that complicated, and we're using really quick, concise, direct verbs. Keep the original pre-preferred state. That's all you need to say.
So the takeaways for kind of how if you're embarking on revising a copy of some sort, let's become professional concisers. And here are the 3 flags you should just always keep in mind when you're approaching revision. It's one, like we said, sentences that are over 25 words should be a red flag. But it's not to say that that's always the rule of thumb.
No,
right?
no. So sentences that are consistently over 25 words should be a red flag. You just want a healthy mix of short and long sentences because it makes it much easier to read.
Yeah, absolutely. So short, healthy, mixing, good. And then prepositions, like we talked about, check it before you wreck it. Absolutely. Again, like Julia was saying, you can't get rid of all of the prepositions, or you shouldn't really want to get rid of all the prepositions, but don't go overboard. And then finally, passive, not active. So these are the 3 things that you should keep in mind as just good rules of thumb. And if you get to the the editing process and you have forgotten all of these flags, when in doubt, just read your sentences out loud. This is something that, Julie and I, when we taught our classes, this is something we told our students pretty frequently as teens in college and everything. Sometimes it is hard for them to always remember red flags, the rules, everything, but just reading your sentences out loud is always just a good habit.
And where you trip up in your sentences as you read them out loud is going to be where people trip up as they read them. So you'll be able to hear if there's any awkwardness in your sentences, and where maybe some of the writing is more dense than it should be.
Definitely. And we have another audience question. So from Dennis Bishop, he's saying, is it a bad idea to use humor to point out the absurdity of your instructions? Sometimes the technology and processes I write about are silly. Is it okay to acknowledge that you recognize this to the reader? And I think you're great at answering this.
I'm actually a huge proponent of making technical writing more human. So I in particular really love humor because sometimes making a joke out of things is the best way to get your point across. That said, it's not it's more of a stylistic thing, and you want to match style with your business and your company. So you just be consistent and make sure that it matches the tone of other writing. And also for the purposes of internationalization, if you're the documentation that you're crafting is meant for somebody who's perhaps like an ESL reader, or it's going to somebody from a different culture or a different country, you also have to be in mind that humor is very, very different from culture to culture, and sometimes it doesn't translate well. In fact, jokes are really difficult to translate into a different language. So I love using humor. I think it's a great way to teach somebody in technical writing and provide a great lesson. But it's a choice that you're making.
Absolutely.
And you have to make that choice purposefully. And make sure it's the best choice for your audience.
I think too, especially when you're writing with other coworkers, you have to kind of be on the same page about those things. Again, stylistic choices, just being really consistent with your company's brand. So I'd say we're definitely fans of humor in technical writing, but it is kind of up to the community that you're particularly in. Certainly. So what we're gonna do is go on to multimedia text. I can see a couple people in the audience are asking about how to deal with photos and videos and all that great stuff. One of our audience members, Askash Saha, is asking, a picture is worth 1,000 words. How many pictures should be included along with the writing? So we are actually going to answer that in this next point that we have. And again, opening it up with our quote, Marshall McLuhan, he is saying, our age of anxiety is, in great part, the result of trying to do today's job with yesterday's tools. And I think this is just, his novel was written in the 60s, but it's so true still today.
Absolutely. With the rise of the internet, we've become a very visual culture. And as the writer, as much as I hate to admit it, there are certain things that we can't do with our writing because a picture is worth 1,000 words. And the way that we learn now is very visually cued. So I am a big proponent, and iFixit is a big proponent of integrating visuals in as a supplement to text. So our text rarely ever stands alone. With every single step that we produce, there's some sort of visual aid to help a reader get through very difficult technical processes.
Definitely. And so we're going to kind of do a nod to the 3 types of visuals that you're going to see most often in technical writing, and really any writing, is videography, photography, and illustrations. And like Julie was saying, there are certainly limits to what we can do with words, which is sad to say as a writer. Sure. I'm very passionate about the written words, but there are limitations. And we definitely had Miro on board a couple months ago talking about photography, and so I know you folks learned a little bit about that. But one of the key things to remember is media is great and fantastic, especially for your modern audiences now, who are pretty versed in how media works. They probably prefer it, most of them. But not all media is created equally. And that's the thing, is that if you're going to do it, if you're going to embark on doing videography, photography, or illustrations and diagrams, you have to be really strategic about it. And so I know this is one of your favorite pictures, Julia, is this beautiful diagram we have of a helicopter, I assume building it.
Yeah, once again, this is documentation that was actually published. We found this in the wild. You're essentially supposed to know from this particular diagram how to put that helicopter together. I don't think that they've accomplished that. No. And it's not a very inviting diagram. There's literally like a helicopter of information and numbers that you'll have to point to. But what's wrong with this particular diagram is that there's way too much information that they're trying to present. Right. And you have to you want to sort of portion, even in diagrams, you want to sort of break information into usable nuggets. Even if you're being visual, there's just, looking at this, you're not going to get at a glance what it is that you're supposed to do.
You need a magnifier to get through all of that.
Yeah.
Definitely. We wanted to compare it also to what I think is a really great diagram. Yeah. So as a comparison, this one is from a company, Mackie, I believe.
Yeah, so Mackie is a maker and producer of musical equipment, and they produce it for experts in their field. So professional musicians are using these guides. But, check them out. Mackie is actually, in my opinion, one of the greatest producers of technical documentation in the world. And going back to that humor question, they actually use quite a bit of humor in their textual documentation. But this particular diagram is great, A, because in the larger document it's paired with textual instructions, and B, because what they've done is really sort of limited the amount of information they're presenting in a single diagram, so you can get what's happening at a glance. So if you're a professional and you're using this equipment, you can very easily pick out in this diagram what particular plugs they're talking about and see at a glance what those plugs are for. And then there's going to be more diagrams next to this diagram that show what the rest of the machine does.
And I don't know how clearly our audience can see it, but there are major chunks of this diagram where the machine, the object in question, is kind of grayed out. Yeah. So you can clearly see that they are focusing on just bits and pieces of it, and I really like that. And just to kind of be understanding of the helicopter diagram, I think it made sense at one point to try to cram all that information into one image, especially if you're printing those out into PDFs and binders. You don't want to be spending so much money on paper, on ink, on all that stuff. But now with the advent of technical documentation online or on your tablets, on your laptops, electronic work instructions or training material, there is absolutely no financial reason, at least not to break it up into maybe more digestible bits, certainly.
Yeah, and all of Mackie's documentation lives online as well. So you can go through and see how they're doing diagrams, because they're just putting together excellent diagrams.
So the next thing we're going to look at are definitely photos. So this one that we're pulling up now is it's from a repair guide for a Canon camera. And I really appreciate the effort that they did with putting the purple mark. However, this image is going to fail our criteria of a well-done visual.
Yeah, bad photos are worse than no photos. Yeah. And so we use photos a lot, and if you really want like a quick run-through on how to take really good professional photos for manuals, I would totally suggest revisiting Miro's presentation on the subject, because they're absolute experts in how to take procedural documentation photos. So we take those photos and we run them side by side with text instructions, and the photos are absolutely a supplement to the text.
Yeah.
So you read it and you get an understanding, and then you can reference the picture and see exactly where a particular connector is.
Definitely. So for comparison, this is actually one that Miro's team did take. We know that technician, Andrew. Thank you so much for doing such a good job over there. And as you can see, clear, clean, white, crisp background. So no mess, no clutter. The focus is really fantastic, and this image is so clear that you don't even need a purple markup or any markup of any kind. They're doing it really, really well. Certainly. So for more information on photography, please check out Miro's Taking Pro Photos. We have that on Dozuki's website at dozuki.com under workshops, so you can check that out. But at least for our purposes, we did want to leave you with 2 takeaways for videography, and that is one, using videos for procedures that text can't clearly convey, as well as making sure that your videos are short. We probably want to aim at about 30 seconds for those. And maybe you can explain a little bit of why we are recommending shorter, going on the shorter side.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I like to say that video instructions are really, really effective, and there's a reason why YouTube has become probably the most referenced how-to resource in the world. If you go into YouTube and you type how-to, you will literally come back with millions upon millions of results. And people reference YouTube all the time because we are such a visual culture, and especially for procedures and how-to knowledge. It's something that requires you to get a feel for something. Right. And that's something a lot of the times it's very difficult to do in text, and it's even hard to do in photography. So for example, like, when is it best to use a video for something? I was making a cheesecake the other day, and part of the textual instructions for making a cheesecake is to know when it's done by taking the pan out, and then you wiggle the pan. And based off of how wiggly or jiggly your cheesecake is, you know that it's set and can come out of the oven. If I was to describe that in writing, like the jiggle factor of my cheesecake, it'd be incredibly difficult to do.
Jiggle factor?
Yeah, jiggle factor of the cheesecake. It would also be incredibly difficult to document that in photos.
Yeah.
But a 10-second video showing someone jiggling, the right consistency of cheesecake, it would be so demonstrative, and that would be all I needed. So that's one of the great things that you can use video for. There's things that do not translate into text well, especially things involving movement.
Yeah.
And another thing to keep in mind is that a lot of the ways that some videos fail is that they're way too long. Readers go into something wanting a particular set of instructions or a bit of information. So I don't need to watch a 30-minute video instruction manual on how to make a cheesecake if I'm looking for just a short demonstration of what like that particular jiggle factor of a cheesecake. So what we like to do is we integrate videos into steps where they're necessary, and then only where they're necessary, where it's really critical that we demonstrate the movement of something.
Yes, absolutely. And so the kind of, I guess, rules of thumb when folks at iFixit include videos go into probably 3 different categories. Demonstrating rotation is certainly a good idea. Involved actions, like threading a sewing machine, or you gave the really great example of tying knots. Knots can be pretty difficult to explain in text, and you can get lost pretty quickly, so that's always a good idea. And then again, probably our jiggle factor would go under the last one, is how much force to use. So in terms of pressure, in terms of texture, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, like if you're peeling back the case of an iMac, it's really helpful to see how much that will bend and how much force it can take before it breaks. And that's something that's really great to describe. So anything involving movement is great.
Definitely. And so we're gonna end where most writing ends, in the editing process. Editing the right way. No, that is not a typo. That was a stylistic choice of ours to have fun. So editing the right way. And to open us up, George Bernard Shaw, the single biggest problem with communication is the illusion it has taken place. I love that because it's so true. I think oftentimes, even in my own writing, I'll write an article or an email or whatever it is and assume that my reader's right on board with me. And oftentimes that's an illusion I have.
Yeah,
definitely.
I think the biggest mistake in terms of editing that new writers can make is just not doing it at all. We tend to, we're finished and we're done. And we'll do a quick quick read through, and then, perfect. But no, you're not done. And unfortunately, the work of a writer is never done. There is no finished document. It can always be made better. And so you really need to meticulously edit, because clarity is so important in technical writing. And, because we're teaching someone how to do something, a badly edited, unclear document means that somebody doesn't get something done.
Yes.
So we have some tips and tricks for editing.
Yeah, absolutely. So so I want to just acknowledge that many of us have been editing incorrectly, and that's understandable. A lot of us learn bad habits like, just you got to just push out for that deadline or whatever it is, or maybe not asking as many people as you should, being a little too scared. The worst, in my opinion, is just not looking grammatical rules up. So our new habits that we all want to try out go into about 5 different ones. The first one, again, like I said, just look it up. Maybe it's a issue with humility or whatever it is. I know sometimes I say, no, I got it. I've been using my semicolons for years. I'm fine with this. But when in doubt, just look it up. We have fantastic resources, not just in libraries or your local bookstore, but the internet, certainly. Googling is probably just a good, quick way to find your answers. Number 2, write and then get distance. I think this is something that's very difficult for people.
Can I revisit the first one real quick?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so I just like to stress that grammar is so important these days, especially if you're writing documentation for any public-facing audience or any third party, because these days, for better or for worse, grammar and grammar errors are associated with competency, and people will look at that and make a judgment of how competent your business is based off of how well you're using grammar. Definitely. So it's now more than ever, it's so imperative to really make sure that your sentences are on point and you're communicating with a business-like tone, not just for clarity, but also for presentation, because people will make judgments based off of how you write.
No, absolutely. And I think it's interesting. Some of you might know, others might not, but in order to work at iFixit in the company, they have you take a grammar test for any department, no matter where you're in. And I know one of the articles that you and Kyle produced a couple years back was talking about that process of only hiring people who are on point with their grammar, and it caused quite a stir. There were thousands of comments on that HBR article.
Yeah, it's only because it points to, like, first of all, how polarizing grammar can be, and then how important it is in a professional setting, just because people do make judgments. And quick anecdote, Miro and I were actually looking at some resumes, and one was for a writer, and he made an unfortunate typo. He meant to write that he graduated magna cum laude, and instead he wrote that he graduated manga cum laude, which is just a really silly, simple typo. But unfortunately, manga is a type of cartoon, and because he made
the same thing.
because he made that typo and that little error, that's what we remembered him for. Is the writer who made that silly typo, and it colored our perspective of him, for better or for worse. So you just have to be very, very careful with grammar.
Definitely. Odds are, especially in today's world with the internet and emailing our resumes and everything, is your writing is probably the first kind of impression people are going to get of you now these days. Odds are your presence online or in electronic documentation, that writing is going to be, that first impression, and making a mistake like that is kind of...
Yeah, people just take you much less seriously, and that's not something you want to have to fight as a technical writer.
Definitely not. And so then, number 2, write and then get distance. I know this can be really difficult, especially for those of us who are on deadlines. It's easy to just kind of wait till the 11th hour and then not have that chance to get the distance. But the distance is so important.
Yeah, I like to take at least 12 hours after I finished a draft to set it aside, and then you can come back to it the next day with fresh eyes, and you're more likely to see your mistakes or errors in flow, information flow. So critical to get that distance.
Absolutely. And then number 3, don't be territorial. Criticism is key. This kind of harkens back to collaborative writing and really just leveraging the knowledge of your experts, of just talking to as many people as you want, even in departments that you might feel like, oh, no, they don't have time, or they don't, this isn't what they're interested in. Get somebody else's criticism. Absolutely.
Yeah. As a writer, for me, criticism is the best tool that I have, and I need feedback. So every single document I produce, I take it not just to other writers. So Kate will read my writing, but I'll take it to the engineers. I'll take it to the designers because I need their specific background. And having that feedback is going to make my next draft a lot better because they're going to see different things based off of the world that they come from.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I know, I mean, you and I, we are constantly writing in our jobs, and sometimes it's easy to just not catch things after a while, and that's totally understandable, but that's where the not being territorial of our writing and handing it off to other people comes very handy.
As many eyes as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. So our fourth one is try a usability test. So for folks who don't know what that is.
Yeah, so especially if you're writing documentation about some sort of procedure, any how-to manual, any training guide, as soon as you finish and you think you have a polished draft and you think it's perfect, hand it to somebody who's never done it. Yeah. There's something called like a hallway usability test. You just walk out to the hallway, hand your writing to 3 people and say, can you do this with these instructions? And if they can follow your instructions from beginning to end, then you have a perfect draft. Chances are that they're going to have some feedback. They're going to go a little awry in different areas. So if you can watch them try to go through that procedure and see where they mess up a little bit, you'll be able to tweak your writing and write better instructions.
Definitely. And then that leads us into our final kind of new habit for people to try out, feedback loop.
Feedback loops. So once, even like when you put out your writing and it's published, you're still not done. Just the lesson here is that writing is never done. So you need feedback from your readers who are actually using the documentation, and you need that to happen over time. So what we do on iFixit is that there's a comment section. And people use the instructions and they can tell us in the comments like what steps were hard, where they went wrong. And we will take those comments and rewrite the instructions all the time to make sure that we can incorporate their tips and tricks or find a better way to describe something. Because I mean, the challenge is that if you're not describing something well, somebody's going to break something. Someone's not going to do the procedure right. So even after it's published, I would say court feedback. Bribe people if you have to. Bribe your readers to give you more feedback because you're going to make better documentation over time if you can continue to revisit the document.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, that leads us to the final portion, which is just questions and answers. I can see a lot of people have some thoughts that they'd like to throw our way. And in the meantime, though, I had maybe some questions of my own. Is just kind of back to a little bit about the collaboration. Is there kind of maybe any takeaways, like or tips with approaching it? How to get people's maybe defenses down when it comes to the writing process? Or
as a writer?
Yeah.
I think it's something that happens naturally over time. When you start sharing your writing for the first time, it feels a little strange because writing is very personal no matter what type of writing you're doing. And we tend to see what happens on the page as an extension of ourselves. But the more feedback that you solicit and the more that you incorporate their criticism and just use it as a tool, the better your writing is going to be. And then the more often you do that, you recognize that your writing has gotten better and more effective. So yeah, I was very much on board with the personal struggles of sharing your writing and getting feedback. But now I love it, and it's the one thing that I need more than anything else, and I recognize that.
Absolutely. I know you like sending things over, and I'm more than happy to help you out whenever it happens, and I love that kind of relationship we've built over some time. We have a question from Susie Lindberg. She says, with so many eyes involved, how do you decide what feedback to accept as a revision, especially if conflicting? This is fantastic. Thank you so much, Susie, for asking this. It's quite a process of what to take and what to not take, because not all criticism, like media, not all criticism is created equally as well.
That's actually a great question. I mean, it comes back to be like a writer. In my view, writers are decision makers, right? We're making hundreds, if not thousands, of small decisions with every sentence we put together. So keep in mind that you are pretty much the ultimate decider. So you have the final call on which criticism you want to take forward.
Yes.
I tend to privilege feedback from the expert community a little more than I do from other people. So If the technical writers or the engineers in our department are like, I'm not sure about the phrasing of this, then I will take that and really meticulously we work it together until we have something that we can move forward with. But I would always say go with your gut. As a writer, you are definitely an expert on how to present information to the public. And if you think that something, like if you decide that maybe that's not the best tip, or like somebody's feedback isn't the best for your purposes, then you can absolutely decide not to take it, because that's your power as a writer.
No, absolutely, I like it. When I've seen you go through the editing process, and sometimes you go, nope, vetoed. That is not my purpose as a writer, and that's well within kind of your, like you said, your discrepancy as a writer to make those choices. Yeah,
because you as a writer, you know your audience best, and you know the purpose of the document. So solicit feedback from everybody, but certainly take feedback with a grain of salt.
Definitely. We have another question from Sean Brown, who's asking, I've heard that you should write at a 5th grade level. Is that good advice? That is certainly something we've heard in the past, is that there are grade levels that in marketing or technical writing that you should kind of aim for.
And there I've actually done some reader tests, like going through and plugging writing into certain forums that'll kick back out your reading and writing level. It's actually super difficult to write at a 5th grade level, and most of you will not. I would say aim for probably like an early high school level. The issue is that most technical writing really overshoots it. So we plugged an Apple manual into one of those readability tests, and it kicked back out at a 24th grade level, which grades actually don't go that high.
No.
So, I think you should be more concerned if you're really overstepping the mark. So 5th grade level, if you can get it down that low, then that's great. I would say aim for high school level.
Definitely.
Or middle school. Right in there is the sweet zone.
Well, it's difficult too, because I know working with students of all different levels in our past, not all 5th graders have the same reading level, so it's a little dangerous to kind of make any grade level rule your constant rule that you always go for. So it's just knowing.
But if you're using plain language and common phrases, and you're very conscious about those decisions, your writing is naturally going to fall into a much more easy to read reading level.
So we have a question kind of going a little bit back to our multimedia section. Pete Mentrenga is asking, how do you feel about using animations to teach? So we didn't really cover animations. iFixit isn't really known for their animations, but maybe in your experiences you've come across some good or bad ones?
I don't have too much personal history with animations, but it's a visual cue, so people respond to that. So I wouldn't privilege it any better or worse than diagrams, which are a great tool as well. It's just a moving diagram. So I think it's a great tool.
Very great. Well, thank you so much. We may have one last question from Dennis Bishop. It would be awesome to point my camera at a laptop and get instructions in an overlay. Oh, he's asking about an iFixit question. Do you think iFixit will eventually use augmented reality apps to provide instructions? I don't think that's something that we can address right now, unless, Julia, you had something to say.
It all depends on, what we can do programmatically. I'm sure anything that we can do to make instructions easier to use, we're gonna attempt to do.
Definitely.
So maybe somewhere along the line, we'll try to get there.
Yeah, and we're gonna conclude on one more question from Jared Grant. What's the best way to handle updating videos hosted online? If I remove the old video and replace it, I break all links. How do you recommend keeping videos current? I would say for that, I guess you just have to talk to your kind of the marketing people that is in your particular company. I would say that's a very company specific question. Perhaps not one that we can answer.
I unfortunately do not know the answer to that question, but I can consult with our video team.
Yes, thank you so much, Jared. Maybe that'll go in our video segment. But thank you so much, everybody. And again, this was our last one of 2014 of the Dozuki workshop series. If you have any more questions, we're opening up a forum online, dozuki.com/answers/technical_writing, where you can ask any questions you have. And also, Julia, again, Thank you so much. She is
welcome.
the co-author of the Technical Writing Handbook. So if you go online, we have that for free, both on the internet and as a downloadable PDF. But as always, thank you so much for joining us today. We really, really appreciate it. And everybody have a really great end to your 2014 year. See you next time.